Thank you very much, Colin, and good afternoon to everyone. And let me start by joining everyone else in thanking the Soufan Group for organizing this amazing event. It's been educating 2 days, and we are very, very grateful for putting such wonderful group of experts in this room. Few words from me on what CTED is. Some of you may be very familiar with us. Some of you may heard this name for the first time. So CTED is a counterterrorism body that supports the UN Security Council Counter-Terrorism Committee. And we do a few things. The first thing we do is assess every state and their counterterrorism capacity. And we also support those states who are in need of support. The other thing that we do, and this is the main focus of this conversation today, is to identify trends, challenges, and gaps in member states' response to the counterterrorism threat. And to do this effectively, we have intensive dialogue with states, but we also have a force multiplier, which is named the Global Research Network. It's a network of around 120 research institutions from all over the world. Each of them brings different perspective on global and local terrorism threats. Each of them is independent. And every opportunity that we have to bring some of those experts together is a wonderful opportunity to learn and to educate ourselves on what these researchers think and how they see the problems of today's world. And we have with us 5 such experts, and I'm very grateful to all of you for joining us today. They were introduced already, so I'll spare with you a detailed introduction, even though every one of them has a very long and impressive biography. And the first question I would like to pose to all of you would be as follows. If you can share with the audience one major concern that you have that is not addressed or not addressed sufficiently, something that you see from your perspective and want the world to know, what would that be? And I want to start with you, Sultan, please.
Thank you, David. I'd like to thank the UN Counter-Terrorism Office and the Soufan Center and QIASS for organizing such an impressive forum. I think the most pressing concern that faces the international community at this moment is the problem of state failure. And state failure is happening in different regions in the world and allows terrorist groups to flourish, and it has a ripple effect on different countries in the region. So if we see the Sahel region, we're seeing an amalgamation of non-state armed groups that are expanding and breaking internationally sanctioned orders. And I think, gathering in this forum, there is an opportunity for policymakers and policy analysts to study such an issue and find evidence-based solutions for this problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Sultan. Thomas, please.
Yeah, thanks, David, and thanks, CTED, for having me on the panel. I'll highlight maybe one trend and one gap as per your introduction that also I have not heard addressed so far too much in this conference. The trend is about youth radicalization into terrorism and violent extremism. This is something where we've seen quite a number of attacks and plots recently conducted or involving minors, which is something not that new in a sense that terrorism has always been a youth issue. But when you look at the numbers of minors, for instance, that are being monitored or prosecuted into terrorism, I mean, 20% of the cases in France, 30% of the cases in Belgium, 25% or 20% of the cases in Australia. I mean, the numbers are staggering. So we need to be better at understanding what is triggering the radicalization of this youth and do something about this. So that's the first trend. The gap, I wanted to say something about the migration-terrorism nexus, something we haven't talked so much about, and yet something that is quite important. And it goes all the way from terrorism triggering migration all the way to migrants being involved, radicalizing and being involved in terrorist attacks, as we've seen in Europe over the past few months, quite a number of attacks in Munich, in Austria, in France, and these attacks, beyond being tragic incidents, have created very strong, maybe exaggerated political response. And I think that's the problem with this issue, and that's the reason why I'm raising it. It's because it's so sensitive, so polarizing, that there is a tendency to succumb to populism. And that is where we need a more nuanced analysis of this phenomenon. We need to understand what are the intersections between these issues, how do they interact, how do they reinforce each other, or how do they not reinforce each other. And we really need to look into this for more evidence-based policies, because it is so sensitive that we really need to look at this. And we need to be careful, and I close here with this. The reason I'm raising this again, it's because it's an issue that either is completely exaggerated, again, by populist voices, or there is a feeling of like, we can't touch it because it's too sensitive. And I think we as researchers, I, as the head of a research institute, I precisely think that there is something happening, we need to look into it, and we should do it and share the knowledge with everyone.
I was saying that we will get back to it, but I want to hear Sue. Sue, you're working for the 1267 monitoring team, which covers, for those of you who are less familiar, the threat of Al-Qaida and ISIL across the world. You have very deep network of intelligence agencies and states that cooperate with you. What are you seeing as the #1 concern right now?
David, thank you very much, and thank you to the Soufan Group and to the government of Qatar for hosting this fabulous event. It's my first time, and it's been extraordinary. Since I will speak in terms of ISIL and Al-Qaida, and I work for UN and body in which we don't prioritize, I can't say just one. So I'm just going to give you a picture of some of the most salient developments that we see from the last report. And I think it's important to note that as we gather here today, it's been more than 25 years since the Al-Qaida conducted the bombings in East Africa, the embassy bombings. It's been more than 10 years since ISIL or Daesh appeared on the scene, and still we are faced with an Al-Qaida, ISIL, and affiliates who are incredibly resilient and adaptable. The threats changed across over the years, but right now what we face is, with counterterrorism pressure, a very extremely adaptable group. The propaganda outputs remain quite extensive. The command and control continues to be decentralized. And the threat to international peace and security, which is why the UN has designated these groups for UN sanctions, posed by the groups, it remains undiminished. So I think it's important to start with that. So a couple things, just in terms of highlights. One is with regard to ISIL leadership. There's growing confidence among a number of member states that Abdulrahman Mumin, who is the head of ISIL in Somalia, is the leader of ISIL. Not all member states agree with that, but quite a few. And if true, and as was discussed on a panel this morning, I believe, it does signify a deliberate pivot towards a decentralized organization away from the core conflict zone of Iraq and Syria to Somalia. So in Syria, and there's been a lot of discussion about this, when HTS took over in HTS coalition, I should say, took over in December, this represents a non-state actor or a terrorist group actually transitioning to governing authority. And I think that this is important for a number of reasons. Right now, the concerns are that Al-Qaida or ISIL will seek to capitalize on the instability in the country or the uncertainty, but also that there could, without consistent counterterrorism pressure on these groups, you could see a rise of both groups trying to take advantage of the situation, and a fragmentation of the factions could lead to greater violence. I note, and there has been a number of discussions about sanctions, and that HTS, as well as its leader, Ahmed al-Shara or al-Juani, is on the list along with 29 other individuals and 10 entities. And I think it's very important to distinguish that for UN sanctions, this is a limited group, but for UN sanctions, not only do all member states need to implement them, but we have a situation where we have exemptions for travel as well as asset freezes. And in fact, we've never really had these exemptions applied to in the 1267 regime. We do on the Taliban, but we've had a number of them. The system seems to be working. The leader is traveling, and the member states hosting him have submitted those travel ban exemptions. But I think it's important that there's a conflation of member state sanctions with UN sanctions. A number of member states have liberalized their sanctions focused on the Assad regime. So that continues to change, but for right now we have UN sanctions as they are. The next issue is Africa. Again, subject to a panel discussion, but what we've seen is a real growth of Al-Qaida and ISIL in Africa. The attacks in West Africa have been quite significant. JNIM continues to expand and to take territory, and we have growing connections among some of the groups, including Al-Shabaab and AQAP. I'll skip over the rest of the developments in Africa, but just to point out that in East Africa, Al-Shabaab continues not only as the primary threat, but ISIL in Somalia, where I mentioned Mohammed is head of, that group is not designated, but it is the primary source of income for ISIL. It has been very adept at fundraising and developing new technologies. Finally, in terms of regions, Afghanistan. Afghanistan continues to be the source of more than 24 terrorist groups and quite a permissive environment. ISIL-K is the single most important group from a point of providing instability in the region and providing the greatest threat to the Taliban and to ethnic minorities. They have engaged in attacks in Iran and Russia, et cetera, and been quite successful. Final issue is the issue of funding, and this is something I think is very important, that these groups, some of them are wealthier, should I say, than others, but they do maintain access to funding. ISIL Core has more than $10 million it has access to in cash in Syria and Iraq. And traditional methods that we count on in terms of kidnap for ransom, extortion, even cattle rustling, things like that. These methods continue to be the primary way they raise funds, but cryptocurrency is increasingly used, especially by ISIL. And in fact, the digital platforms that are being used are very much of concern. Anonymity-enhanced cryptocurrencies, AECs, such as Monero, has provided a significant advantage to ISIL-K, and it's something that we're watching, very concerned about. So with that, let me stop. It's a tour of the horizon. Apologies.
It was a grand tour, but we will go deeper in a minute. Harmonie, please, the same question. What is the one thing that concerns you most and you want to bring to the attention of this audience?
There we go. Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you for inviting me and for the Soufan Group and the Government of Qatar for the invitation. I think for me, we've spoken a lot in this conference about lessons learned. And one thing that worries me is that there are certain lessons that we're very bad at learning, clearly. And the prime example, the prime situation for me, which worries me because we're not learning lessons, is the situation of the detention system in northeast Syria. So the camps, the detention centers of young boys, and the prisons. And my concern here is that this is an international problem. It's a transnational problem. It involves non-state armed groups. It involves an interim administration. It involves neighboring countries. It involves a whole slew of international actors. And it has festered, and it continues to fester now 6 years later, right? With a description of conditions in the camps that amount to cruel and inhuman and degrading treatment of children, countries that are denationalizing their citizens in ways that are potentially rendering them stateless, and just a refusal to engage with the question. And when it comes to terrorism and counter-terrorism, we know that letting situations like that fester is exactly the kind of dangerous breeding ground that leads to what can happen in 5 years' time, in 10 years' time. And this is, what worries me is that we know this, right? We have seen this 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. We've written about it. And so the great challenge for me is to, how do we convince national governments to take the political risk, take internal domestic political risks to do things that will serve their security down the line. This is the greatest challenge we have, because when you speak to privately to people in the Ministry of Interior and the Ministry of Defense, they will say, yeah, of course you're right. And then you say, okay, but what are we going to do about it? Oh, no, but we can't. And this, for me, is the greatest challenge. How do we make sure that, we move past that?
How we continue to work on the long term without sacrificing short term. We will get back to it, and I took good notes of that. But I want to quickly move to Adejoké. Adejoké, same question. What is the one thing that concerns you most?
Thank you so much, David, and thank you so much to the Soufan Center, the organizers, for this amazing forum. So I'm coming from a justice and accountability lens, and I would say then that the main issue where we still need to see some progress concerns overly broad definitions of terrorism that are in the national legislations that do not actually conform to international legal standards. They also do not conform to what we find in the Security Council resolutions, and as such, states find themselves potentially in breach of international law. And so I remember in 2021, there's a CTED survey that found that there were 65% of member states that had either vague or very broad terminology for terrorism. And in a sense, what does this mean? I think maybe it's helpful to just set out that in terms of general understood principles of what the crime of terrorism is, you're looking for a violent act that's performed intentionally. You're looking for a certain outcome, such as the likelihood of death. And you're looking for a terrorist purpose, such as to compel a government to perform in a certain way or to intimidate a civilian population. And so when we talk about legislation, terminology, and domestic laws that are overly broad is where you then don't have these elements, right? So you have, for example, references to prejudicial acts that are prejudicial to the interest of a state. And that's relatively broad and could actually mean anything. And so the challenge there, of course, as we know, is that you're facing a violation of human rights and fundamental freedoms. But at the same time, in as much as states obviously would prioritize national interest, at the same time, states are, with such broad definitions are actually impacting their own resources, because then you're triggering resources that really should be used for actual terrorist cases as opposed to broad situations where, for example, a state could end up criminalizing the right to protest, which is not a terrorist offense. And so, of course, you get a lot of pushback from states that have such legislation, saying that the reason why they have to have such broad definitions is because we are living in evolving times. Just yesterday, the last panel talked about technology and AI in this space and cyber warfare, and as such that it's important then to have these vague laws that could then be used one day to address that. But they're two separate things. The crime of terrorism is one thing, and you can certainly also criminalize these other conducts, cyber warfare and so on, without calling it something that it is not. So I'll stop there, but that is a key issue.
Thank you. And I think it was a beautiful demonstration so far of the value that we get at CTED from the Global Research Network, because you've just seen 5 top experts being asked the same questions. Each of them gives a different response, and all 5 responses are correct, because each of them sees a different perspective of where the challenge is coming from. So with your permission, I would like to dig deeper a little bit on each of the issues that you raised, and I want to start with you, Sue. You mentioned the existence of 25 years since the Kenya and Tanzania attacks, and the existence and resilience of Al-Qaida since then. And then at the end, you mentioned the financing of its activities. Over the last 25 years, and let's say more so in the last few years, we've seen enormous development in financing technologies. how much are you seeing that in the world of Al-Qaeda? Are they still relying on cash, hawalas, on other traditional systems, or that they also made the technological leap into crypto and value systems and other ways of funding?
Thanks, David. Well, with time, there's been an evolution. Remember, initially, Al-Qaeda was quite centrally structured, command and control, financing arms, et cetera. I think one of the hallmarks is adaptability. And the fact is that the groups are starting to do fundraising on the basis of what they have access to. So ISIL, again, having access to cash reserves, ample. At one point, it was 25 to 50 billion that we expected. That has gone down over time. Counter-terrorism efforts have taken a toll. But what they are increasingly doing is the amount coming in is less than the amount being spent. And so there has been a new mandate, if you will, to ISIL affiliates to self-finance, raise funds. You can no longer count on the money coming from ISIS or Daesh Central. So I think that's important. While most of the funds, or what we know, travel through traditional methods, the fundraising through the traditional ways and moving it through hawala, informal value transfer systems, or cash, increasingly it is the interest in terms of cryptocurrency. And each group can be a little bit different. Some have a greater proficiency with regard to cryptocurrencies. As I said, ISIL-K has really been out there. The Voice of Khorasan magazine, every month for a period of more than a year now, has a QR code for donations. And in doing so, they use the same QR code. It's not like they have to change it because it's being detected. So these kind of very strong cryptocurrencies pose challenges in terms of detection, but they are raising funds that way. And it's something I think that it evolves, and it has evolved over a period of time, and it's something we need to be aware of. With regard to technology, as has been discussed in the conference, there is growing use of advanced technology. The terrorist groups themselves have indicated interest with regard to artificial intelligence. They've been experimenting with it, and they have been, from the perspective of just getting out there, they're using technology, 3D printers for munitions components, et cetera. So it's something that the kind of work that groups who are here trying to monitor use of internet, raising funds, the kind of radicalization, et cetera, so important that we all come together and share information.
I think that's very interesting because in the previous panel, one of the lessons that was mentioned by non-state actors was to dumb down their activities and rely less on technology for their own survival, because technology is vulnerable and can be monitored and can be exposed to the activities. And at the same time, you're seeing when it comes to financing of their activities, they're growingly feeling more comfortable with advanced technology. So we always have to be watchful of both sides, of the low-tech and the high-tech, in order to provide a meaningful response. For those of you who want to follow more into this issue, the Security Council Counter-Terrorism Committee has recently adopted what is named the Algeria Good Practices on new payment methods. It has a longer name, but I won't bother you with that. And it offers some good practices on how member states can deal better with the way terrorists are using new technologies in order to finance their activities. So I hope we'll have more time to discuss this, but I am beginning to be conscious of it. So over to you, Thomas. You mentioned Europe, and you are an institution that is based in the heart of Europe. And you mentioned also migration as something that Europe is dealing more. What are you seeing in terms of foreign terrorist fighters, returnees coming, and the way Europe is dealing with the challenge?
Sure.
And aside, because what about the reaction from far right to this migration crisis, and how that translates into the terrorist threat Europe is facing?
Sure. I mean, thanks, David. And by the way, I mean, these issues are to some extent connected because, I mean, for instance, if you talk to counterterrorism services, one thing that they're raising as an issue is the risk of terrorist actors infiltrating migration flows, as the Frank fighters did to return undetected into Europe and commit the attacks in Paris and Brussels in 2015, 2016, for instance. And that risk remains. If you read the excellent reports from the UN monitoring team, you actually see some of these concerns being expressed now about potentially individuals related to ISKP trying to infiltrate, again, Europe through Ukraine or through Turkey, again, with this notion that they could enter Europe undetected. So that is one very clear challenge that the counterterrorism services officials, if you read their reports, if you talk to them, that they're raising. The other aspect of it is they're also taking the threat of asylum seekers, irregular immigrants very seriously. If you look at number of plots, there's been a few attacks, there's been a few plots. If you look at the numbers of individuals that are being monitored as radicalizing or in the process of radicalization into terrorism, you see also a number of individuals that fit that category of asylum seekers or irregular immigrants or migrants under an expulsion orders. But the other side of this is that those numbers are extremely small. Sorry. So the number of what you could call irregular immigrants or recent immigrants that are being monitored or suspected of terrorism is a very small fraction of all terrorist suspects in Europe. And if you speak to the counterterrorism services, they will also tell you that this is something they're looking into as other threats, but for them, it's again only a small part of the whole spectrum of terrorist threats that they're looking at. So I think that is something quite important to acknowledge. And also, for the sake of a study that we did and which will come out, shameless self-promotion, but that will come up in the coming few weeks. We also, in addition to doing an extensive literature review, in addition to speaking to counterterrorism officials, we also collected data about all terrorist attacks committed over the past 10 years in Europe. And we identified about 40 attacks and perpetrators that could be qualified as first-generation immigrants that were in Europe for less than 10 years as one category. You have about 40 plots there over the past 40 years. What is really interesting there, I mean, that shows that there is something that requires counterterrorism services to look into this phenomenon very concretely. But interestingly, the vast majority of these individuals were legal residents. The vast majority of these individuals had been in Europe for over 5 years when they perpetrated the attacks. So this basically suggests very strongly that terrorism is not something that we imported. These individuals radicalized when they were already in Europe. So again, this is something that we have to look into ourselves, into our source for the causes of this problem. And I think and the other thing that we also found out with our data set is that the phenomenon is extremely stable over time. So these 40 attacks, you can see it's a very flat line over the past 10 years. So it's not something that is rising. So that goes against, I would say, the mainstream popular or populist narrative in Europe that immigration is a security threat and that the response should be stopping immigration, because stopping immigration will not bring you more security when it comes to counterterrorism, certainly not. But at the same time, again, looking at all these incidents and speaking to counterterrorism officials in Europe, the necessity to focus on that small part of the threat is there, and it does raise very concrete operational challenges when it comes to interoperability of databases in terms of collecting and using biometrics, when it comes to how do you deal with clandestine individuals who don't have like a known address and also don't have access to social services, to health services. A lot of these people are extremely vulnerable. And so the first reaction you would have with a national citizen would be to provide with PCV support, for instance, like mental health support, psychological support, PCV management, case management. But it's almost impossible to do that with irregular clandestine migrants because it doesn't fit the system. And so that is also a very concrete challenge of the CT and PCV services. So again, we will publish this study in a few weeks, but I think this is a topic that has been left aside for too long, and we really need to look into it in a very nuanced manner, but also recognizing that there is something that we need to look at.
I think you Joke, also touched upon the gap between how the threat is perceived by researchers like you and what you're seeing coming up from governments. And either governments are looking for what is popular, what is perceived as the threat, and ignoring the other, or sometimes out of convenience or political interest, focus on other opposition leaders, journalists, civil society, religious leaders, instead of focusing on what is the real core terrorism threat. And you've done a wonderful research, and I'm happy to share that Joke worked with us, CTED, on a great research relating to sexual and gender-based violence, and that also another area where we're not seeing response or proper response of government. So I don't want to take too much of your time, so please.
No, thank you so much. And just as you were listing the various people that and entities that come under attack with these broad understandings of terrorism include, of course, humanitarian aid workers, and who are being accused of committing acts of terrorism by providing humanitarian aid, and that again goes against what the definition of terrorism or the conceptualization of terrorism is understood to be. And as you mentioned, with respect to sexual and gender-based violence, as we know, there are certain terrorist groups for whom SGBV is a core part of their modus operandi. It's actually a core part of their ideology. And part of the work CTED has done, and I've done in the space of technical assistance and capacity building, has been working with national prosecutors and investigators to be able to build their capacity to prosecute these crimes committed by terrorist organizations, terrorist actors like Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab, for example, to be able to prosecute them within and recognizing that context of terrorism. And so, of course, very happy to share a case regarding Nigeria, where in 2023, Nigeria was the very first country globally, and of course, using its counter-terrorism legislation to properly identify and prosecute the act of, whether it's rape, forced pregnancy, as an act of terrorism. And that was, that achievement is laudable. And I think not just because of the provision of technical assistance, but because of the collaborative way I think all stakeholders worked together to achieve that, to get to that point of a deeper understanding of the law as it is and the application of it. And so that kind of ties in with the second point that I sort of want to make about an area of concern. So I think it's a wonderful thing where we are seeing increase in technical assistance, technical legal support, but it's so important that these are done in a manner that's collaborative if we really want to see success, because I would say that the success that we could see from the Nigeria example, the Nigeria project is really because from conception, design to execution, it really took into account the needs and the expertise of the various stakeholders that were involved. And very oftentimes we see, especially donor-funded projects, that you may see there is a prioritization of the donor's goals and objectives, less so the needs of the entities that are receiving the benefits. And so then you may see projects that are not successful, in quotes, because they're not actually catering to the context in which the project is supposed to be executed. And so dealing with those power dynamics is extremely important to avoid a default to sort of like a top-down approach, or an approach that prioritizes the knowledge of the global north over the knowledge of the global south, and so on. And I think that sort of like ties also then to a final point, again connected with funding, but a different kind of funding. So not so much funding of terrorist organizations, but funding of these projects. One important thing is sustainability. So started the Nigeria project, or at least I got involved in it in 2016, and I just mentioned the conviction was 2023. And we know that with various projects, you could have very short funding cycles. And so if donor organizations, donor entities are focused on quick wins or expecting, convictions and cases within the first 6 months or a year, you're not going to get that, because justice takes time, change takes time, and it does take time for us to get to where we want to get to. And so connected to that also is, what exactly is success? Is success the number of trainings? Is success, a conviction, or is success actual change within the systems?
Why do you think donors are working this way? I mean, is it just cookie cutter approach? Is it that they're focused more on their political interest in the country? What is the reason that they're not willing to invest in the longer term, before we get to Harmonie with the same question?
Yeah, I would say, it's a combination of various factors. And because at the end of the day, of course, donors also have their own constituents to please, essentially, and so they have their own interests. But I think when we look at the international response, especially with respect to justice accountability, it really has to be a response that takes into account the context, takes into account the challenges, and not only focused on the interest of the donor.
Okay. It leads me straight to Harmonie. Harmonie, you touched on a very important point. You said states, when they deal with the issue of terrorism, they look on the threat that is in front of them and are unwilling to invest in longer-term solutions. They're not politically popular, but they are a must. When you look on ways to deal with the terrorism challenge in a deeper way, how can we convince governments to move from the next elections to looking on those children in Al-Khol and understand what I'm sure every person in the audience understands, that if the problem will remain in 10 years from now, it will be a global problem. It won't be kept to Al-Khol, it won't be kept to Syria. It will be everywhere. So what in government's response doesn't work, and how can we deal with terrorism in a much more impactful way?
Thank you. I mean, I think for me, the trick, it's not a trick, but the sort of is a change of framing. So we stop looking at just the violence as just the terrorist violence, and we look at the conflict. Right? If we move away from terrorism and move towards conflict analysis, conflict resolution, conflict transformation, I remember doing a master's in conflict resolution 20 years ago. We had all these frameworks. This is 2003, and I said, well, let's look at applying this to terrorism. Oh no, it doesn't apply to terrorism. Why not? It is a conflict, right? And terrorism happens to be one of the strategies used by one or several parties in it. But by focusing so much on the acts of violence and not on the conflict dynamics behind it, I think that has been one of the major problems that we've had in the last 25 years. And, there are reasons for that. There are reasons that the immediacy, particularly the September 11th attacks, but, the immediacy of the spectacular led to knee-jerk reactions, led to we have to do this now, we have to solve it quickly in a definite way. Conflicts are never solved in a definite way quickly. It never exists. And I think that the fact that this conference is called non-state actors, I think is wonderful in itself, right? Because it is a move away from just focusing on the violence, and specifically the terrorist form of violence, and then expanding to sexual-based violence and other types of violence, but also expanding it beyond the violence and understanding that a lot of these groups do many other things, right? They attract popular support, they gather taxes, they provide health and dental services, they do many other things. And looking at the violence in this much broader way, I think is absolutely essential to certainly to sort of address the long term as well as the short term, because in conflict resolution and transformation, we do have frameworks to do both, right? But also, now, the second part is the more difficult part. It's convincing politicians that are on short-term electoral cycles that the long-term matters, and it matters more than whether they get re-elected in the next one. And that's a very, very difficult thing to do. I think there has to be sort of long-term work with the popular media, sort of not necessarily, you know, if you only read The Guardian to a certain degree, you're fine. But I think a lot, you know, in the context of the UK, a lot of politicians are scared about the headline of the Daily Mail. That's what they're scared about, right? They're not scared about what the BBC is going to say. And so it's working with journalists, training the media to look at these conflicts in ways that don't exacerbate things, but that actually allow us to work on these long-term solutions.
We also see this challenge in the Security Council dynamics relating to long-term approaches. Have you tried to speak with governments, and if so, what was the response?
So I've tried to speak to parliamentarians primarily, but also with governments on the question specifically of Al-Hol and the camps. And what the frustrating part is that when you speak to them, you seem to get through to them, right? We seem to be in agreement, and particularly when it comes to the question of the camps. I presented in Parliament not too long ago, and I was saying the security people agree, the humanitarian people agree, the human rights people agree. Everyone seems to agree, but still there is this sort of, it's political capital, and it's the fear of losing political capital. So I think we need to, I don't know how we find a way to train a new class of politicians that have the courage to lose, right?
Yeah, courage to lose. We started with you, Sultan, and I want to go back to you, because the point that Harmonie touches is exactly are the points of your recently concluded massive research. So first, congratulations on concluding it. You discussed, and maybe you want to share yourself, the end cycle of terrorism. And what Harmonie says, I'm trying with governments to convince them to adopt a long-term approach that goes beyond the immediate response to a terrorist attack. It doesn't work. What does your research show about the end game of terrorism? How can we bring an end to this phenomenon? And you mentioned the issue, the responsibility of the state. So let's go back to it, please.
Thank you so much. Just to comment quickly on Harmonie's remarks on Al-Hol camp, I think what became of Al-Hol camp is it became a toxic issue. And sometimes there are innovative solutions that happened in Islamic countries before in terms of dealing with terrorist actors and youth radicalized. We've seen reintegration programs happening in Mauritania, some of them in Algeria and Saudi Arabia and even in Qatar, where terrorists who did not have enough knowledge of religion were debated by religious scholars who are moderate and they believe in the borders of the nation states, which is an important issue. And many of them left that terrorist ideology. So this is an issue which some colleagues are not aware of, and it's important to include these types of solutions in dealing with what's happening in Al-Hol. It's a camp of 50,000 people, and mostly young and women, and many of them are having now extra grievances with the treatment. But there is a big possibility, if there is a proper plan, to be able to reintegrate part of that population back into the community. And I think with the current government in Syria, there is a big possibility of reaching that end stage, because they've been through the stage of terrorism and they've changed. I think the main issue, David, which you pointed out about my research, is there is a difference between national terrorist groups who believe they have nationally limited grievances And there are the transnational groups such as Al-Qaida and ISIS, which are a different set of groups that make it harder to deal with. I think right now we're seeing a post-ideology era in terms of terrorist groups in many areas. I think in Somalia, in West Africa, and As-Sahel, many of these essentially terrorist groups that started with religious aims have become a mix of ignorance in religion and an alliance with criminal groups. And that makes it easier for states in these regions to tackle them, because if you solve part of the grievances and if you conduct a proper counterinsurgency approach to some of these groups, there is a possibility of ending the threat. I think one of the main areas to deal with terrorist groups that are national, depends on their, of course, classification, but if they're a national group, then part of it is opening channels of communications with the moderate parts of that even radical group. And once there is an understanding, there is an ideological revision that happens in that group, it makes it possible to divide the group into two parts and engage in discussions with the part that believes in the nation-state project. I think we're coming at an inflection point in the international community where borders are becoming an easy target, and it's important to sanctify the borders of each state. This is first, I think, and there are many examples of political inclusion of former terrorist groups into legitimate groups, such as the PLO in the late 1990s, when they found that there is an opening that they could get and gain legitimacy. They've renounced violence and went into politics through the diplomatic ways. We see the example of Syria now, where over 10 years, in the beginning, HTS were actually burning the Syrian flag. And the last few months, we see them raising the nation flag of Syria, and they believe in the nation project of Syria. There is also, the example of the experience of Britain with the IRA, where they've reached a power sharing agreement. So you need to, as any mediator in the world, there is a conflict analysis, which phase is the terrorist group in. If it's still in the inception phase, there are different ways to deal with it. If it's in the middle phase, there is a different way of dealing with it. And then there is also the stalemate of a conflict, where there are opportunities for mediators to come in and offer a line for the nation state and for that group out of the stalemate. There is the example of Chad, where Qatar mediated between the national government and around 50 rebel groups in Chad. Some of them were designated as terrorist groups by the government, but when the mediator laid groundwork of an agreement that opened the way for these rebel groups to see a way out of armed resistance into politics again, both sides reach an agreement. They are still durable, but there is also other issues that are coming up in the future. In Somalia, what we're hearing from Somali colleagues who are aware of the issues on the ground is that the example of Syria is being listened to in Somalia, and the groups there have changed actually their propaganda to become more nationally oriented. A Somali nationalism is being used as a slogan, and this is, I think, positive for Somalia in terms of allowing for a way outside of continuous violence, putting both groups into a negotiated settlement sometime in the future.
I'm glad we started with you, and I'm glad that we're ending with you, because you gave us some optimism to share. And it is true, you said it at the beginning, that some parts of the group will never engage and you cannot handle with them. But there are other parts, and I took good notes of the tools that you offer, the tools that are in the hands of the mediator, offering belonging, offering participation, offering engagement, and addressing the grievances of some part of that terrorist group can lead them to leave the course of violence and become part of the legitimate political system if they see that their participation actually leads them to the outcome. Please.
Just to make it very clear, I think transnationalism is a big threat, and it's very hard to mediate between groups that have transnational aims. There are different toolkits for the international community to deal with international threats, but once a group becomes a nationally oriented group, then it makes it easier for states to mediate in, especially if the phase of the conflict is conducive for talks, regional support, and making sure that regional countries are on board in terms of trying to deal with this issue, and also domestic politics in any country is ready to deal with such groups.
I would have loved to continue this conversation, but our buzzers here are shouting at us. So I want to thank all of you, and I'm glad that we concluded with some optimism about that there is a way out, and there are solutions, and there are experiences that actually worked in driving a terrorist organization away from violence and towards more political participation in a way that benefits everyone. So thank you all for joining us, and thank you, this group of experts, for being with us today.